To help us get our bearings a little bit in terms of how we've moved forward from last week's ideas, I put this timeline together. So we are now in the historical moment when we're talking about desegregation, where we're moving between modern liberalism, the liberalism discussed in Chapter 5 of Tozer, and neoliberalism, which is something we're going to talk about in week 3. The kind of key takeaways here is our we see a huge increase in reliance on science and technology, and an increasing dominance of top-down decision-making, centralized decision-making, and a reliance on the market, meaning an economic motivation for decisions in education. Um, One of the things that we also have talked about up to this point is the idea in Chapter 4 of Tozer that African Americans have a long history of fighting very vigorously for education, including creating common school systems. It's important to reiterate that point. It talks about this in Tozer, but a lot of people don't realize the fact that there would be no common school for anybody in the South if it weren't for African Americans taking the initiative to create that. Low-income white people also did not have access to public schools the way they did after African Americans took that initiative through the Rosenwald Fund and other philanthropy initiatives and built those schools from the ground up. And that's a huge accomplishment when you consider how much institutional racism was there, how much was stacked against any sort of educational benefit, and you still see communities prevail because they had that value of education as a freedom struggle, as this affirmation of their humanity, and as a way of improving their situation. So if we keep moving with this timeline, and we want to walk through the court cases. Brown starts us off. I think most of us are pretty familiar with Brown versus Board of Education. It's a pretty famous court case, of course. But these other things that come after it actually are equally as important, even though they're less well known. The reason they're important is because these are all the little steps that either expanded and enforced Brown, or that started to retrench and undermine it. So if we follow the timeline, one of the things we can see is that the 1964 Civil Rights Act played a huge role, as did the Green and the Swan cases. When we get to the early 70s with Rodriguez and Milliken, we start to see resistance to any further progress. We start to see the Supreme Court actually start to retrench or dial back its support, making it harder and harder to have meaningful or substantive desegregation. And there's a lot of different reasons for that. Massive resistance is not the only reason, but it plays a significant role in the politics of the time. And what I mean by massive resistance is what you saw in that video, the Eyes on the Prize video, what you saw all across the South and in northern cities, which is people coming out by the hundreds and even the thousands into the street to block desegregation, where white people were just adamant, this will not happen. You passed this law, go ahead and try and enforce it. And there was this understanding on the part of these white resistors that if they were willing to use violence, if they were willing to collectively have this mob mentality, they may get away with it because there was only so much that the government would be willing to do to fight them. So it created a really tough situation, especially in the South, because a lot of the same people who were massive resistors were people who had positions of authority and were able to then undermine these efforts. So some of the tactics of massive resistance, in addition to this widespread violence, include closing schools, just straight up closing schools across cities and even across states. Virginia, for example, shut down county after county of public schools, and some for a very long time, where they shut down some public schools for as long as 5 years, rather than desegregate them. So that is a little hint as to why Brown didn't go as far as it could have. When there's that level of massive resistance, it's very hard to triumph over it, especially when the state and federal governments are unwilling to challenge their own. So even in the face of that massive resistance, though, some of these court cases, some of these pieces of legislation are very important because they put tools in the hands of people who want to enforce Brown. So it's not a matter of all white people are racist, all African Americans are fighting for civil rights. It's a lot more complicated than that. But for those white people who did want to actually move forward with desegregation, they needed that support. They needed that enforcement. So 1964 and the Civil Rights Act, that became a big help, where the federal government kind of stepped up a little bit more and wasn't just passively watching the states do what they would with the Brown ruling. Instead, they took a more proactive stance. So the Civil Rights Act empowered the Justice Department to pursue court cases on behalf of plaintiffs. It empowered them to use money to collect data for these court cases. It also is the same year that that clause, with all deliberate speed, expired, meaning that it was a lot easier to set clear, firm timelines and keep that moving. There was also, at this time period, a full-fledged civil rights movement underway, and that created a lot of pressure. And unlike earlier times, there was a lot more access to media at a national and even international level. So we see television playing a really big role in publicizing this, and again, making the U.S. and the South in particular look really, really terrible. So in '64, all of that stuff's going on. The Vietnam War is happening. There's huge wealth inequalities. They're starting other civil rights movements with other racial groups, with women. We see a lot of different things happening. And Lyndon Johnson, as president, is starting to think, how can we address a lot of this unrest and create some stability, and also try and remedy some of the problems that are creating this tension? So a lot of federal legislation starts coming through along with the Civil Rights Act. We see this Great Society legislation package coming through. Okay. So, well, I got a little ahead of myself, but so the Civil Rights Act, again, was important. Some of the key pieces of legislation for the war on poverty include the 1965 Voting Act, the 65 Elementary and Secondary Education Act. Now that we're going to keep talking about. No Child Left Behind is the same thing as the Elementary and Secondary Education Act. No Child Left Behind is just the name that President Bush gave to the ESEA when he reauthorized it. But it's the same piece of legislation, just different presidents give their own little fancy name to it whenever they reauthorize it. But it's the same thing. So the Elementary and Secondary Education Act is where things like Title I monies come from, and that started during this time period. The other really important thing that happened in '65 is that the federal government became empowered to cut off funding from schools that did not comply with desegregation. So that gave a lot more teeth to desegregation efforts. And then the last piece of legislation was the '68 Fair Housing Act. So in general, this war on poverty legislation had a profound impact, and it created a lot of different footholds for people who were trying to move things along and move things forward. So we start to see enforcement in '64. We start to see the federal government being more proactive, being more supportive, and having actually some tools in its hand to do this enforcement. Then in '68, we start to see criteria laid out that is telling people exactly what you need to do to be desegregated. Up until that time, it was very fuzzy. What does it mean? Once we remove the law, is that it? Or do we have to take proactive, affirmative steps in order to be desegregated? So this court case, Green versus County School Board of New Kent County, answers that question. The court laid out what they call the green factors, and they defined what it meant to achieve unitary status. Now, unitary status is the term for being desegregated completely. What it means is that under legal segregation, there was a black system of schooling and a white system of schooling. There was a dual system, in other words. So once you've managed to unify that dual system, then you've achieved unitary status. In other words, where it's not distinguishable what's the white system and what's the black system. So the green factors become very important because it provides guidance and very explicit criteria for being unitary. So some of the factors that that court case laid out include students of all races receiving the same quality education, teaching assignments being race neutral, pupil assignments race neutral, everyone has access to transportation, equal allocation of resources, and so forth. So it's very concrete. So the next step then is, okay, we've said we're going to enforce it. We've told you what it looks like once you've achieved unitary status. Now what are your remedies going to be to get to unitary status? What exactly are your strategies? Swan lays out some of the strategies that are available to districts. And the biggest one that districts relied on was busing. Busing was extremely controversial, and it still is a very controversial remedy, as you can see from that Boston Eyes on the Prize video. But what the court was saying in 1971 is that it's appropriate, that it's legal and you are able to use it. A lot of districts really resisted this quite a bit. The other thing that this did was it basically affirmed the right of the federal judge to have discretion in choosing a remedy. In other words, leaving it to their best judgment as to how to solve the problem that was laid out before them. So up until this time, federal judges had a lot of power and were given a lot of respect and trust in terms of, you know, them being the ones to figure out what it is that they should do to move forward. However, once we get into the Nixon era in the late 60s, early 70s, we see a big shift away from active enforcement. So Nixon kind of figured out, along with some other politicians before him, that he didn't necessarily need to court African American voters in order to be politically successful. He basically decided, I'm going to go ahead and write that off, and instead I'm going to appeal to conservative, resistant white Southern voters. And he coined the term the Southern strategy to name that choice. And Reagan later opted for the same Southern strategy. A lot of other politicians did as well, but Nixon was particularly good at it. The other impact that Nixon had on moving away from active enforcement is during his time as president, he had a very unique opportunity to, you know, through time appoint 4 new federal Supreme Court judges, which completely shifted the court away from that activist pro-desegregation standpoint that it had up until then. So instead, the court was shifted in a much more conservative, anti-desegregation way, and the rulings that followed are very much an illustration of that ideological shift.